Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us here tonight. I'm Steve Cohen. I'm a professor at Columbia University, and I'm also the Senior Vice Dean of Columbia's School of Professional Studies. I also direct two sustainability management and policy programs at the university and have been there for a while. I want to first thank the events team of Columbia's School of Professional Studies for putting this event together, and also to our distinguished lecturer and science feature writer for the New York Times, Claudia Dreyfus, who will be moderating this event tonight. Claudia is one of my star faculty, and she is really a terrific interviewer, as you'll see tonight. I'd also like to thank our panelists joining us tonight. We have Naomi Oreskes, a professor at Harvard University, and Cornelia Dean, a distinguished lecturer and writer in residence at Brown University, and a science writer and former science editor of the New York Times. They're both extraordinary professionals and at the forefront of science advocacy and communication. So I will not only be introducing tonight, I'll also be one of the panel members. Today's event brings our esteemed panelists together and me to discuss the politicization of science, especially as it relates to the ongoing coronavirus pandemic and climate change policy in the United States. Scientific facts need to be understood, not believed or worshiped. And this requires that we understand facts in order to make effective change and decision making. So tonight promises to be a fascinating conversation. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to my colleague, Claudia Dreyfus.
Thank you, Dean Cohen, and a good welcome to you, to our speakers, and to the Science and Technology Committee. Tonight, we're going to discuss a topic that a year ago wasn't very high on most people's agenda, but tonight may be number one. We're talking about how scientific inquiry, once an almost invisible area of national life, has become enmeshed in partisan politics. Science, really? Like many of you here, I grew up in an era when science was revered. I remember the grief around Albert Einstein's death. Maybe that was 1956, something like that. And the joy of lining up with my classmates for that first polio shot in our free Tootsie Pop roll. I remember Sputnik and the moonshot. And today, in the midst of a once in a century worldwide pandemic, the wearers of facial masks are mocked by the White House. Public health measures in many localities are ignored, and Dr. Anthony Fauci needs to be protected by armed guards. Let me quickly show you two maps. This was from the New York Times last week, and it shows us the darkest reds are where ICU beds are completely occupied, and the lighter oranges and yellows are where there are severe problems too. And the next map uh, is the political votes in the last election. There are huge overlaps. How did we get here? We're going to discuss that. Dr. Cohen and our guests are both scholars and eyewitnesses to the events that brought us to this remarkable moment. And I'm sure they're going to have some enlightening perspectives. Steve Cohen is a senior vice dean of the School of Professional Studies, and for 12 years, he was the executive director of uh, the Earth Institute of Columbia, which is the largest single school and department at Columbia University. And he is also the uh, leading author, if you could call him that, of many, many programs in the scientific area, to the point where he leaves most of us who've watched his creativity in this area just breathless. Here is the cover of the latest of his textbooks, The Sustainable City, but it's one of many. Long ago and far away in the late 1970s, he was a staffer at the newly formed Federal Environmental Protection Agency. People may not know this about him. And he was a part of the team that planned the Superfund toxic waste cleanup program. Dr. Cohen, tell us, what was the atmosphere like in the 1970s EPA? Did Democrats and Republicans work together on implementing the newly minted Clean Air and Water Act? What'd you see then?
Well, at the start, EPA was not seen as a political agency. It was seen as the product of consensus between Democrats and Republicans. At Columbia, we had a course taught by a fellow named Leon Billings and another fellow named Tom Jorling, who were the directors of the staffs of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. Jorling was the Republican, although eventually became a Democrat, and Billings was a Democrat. And essentially, people worked together at that time. This was considered a public health issue, a general issue that most people supported. I think polling data shows that most people still support environmental protection, but then it really was overwhelming. And it was a very creative and positive time. We didn't know a lot, but we worked hard and we cared a lot.
So, what changed? Did
Well,
something was there a change?
well, I think at a certain point, some of this became partisan. There really hasn't been a new piece of environmental legislation passed at the federal level since the early 1990s. And so we're kind of ossified in the past. It's a problem. I think some parts of environmental protection became politicized, although I would say that when you get down to the local level, everybody likes to breathe, and nobody wants to drink poisoned water or have toxic waste in their basement. So in the end, there is still a very broad consensus. But I think that some political leaders have manipulated some of these issues over the past couple of decades with unfortunate results. Although a lot of us have moved our attention to the local and state level, where we've had a great deal of success in improving protections of the environment. The environment today in 2020 is far cleaner than it was when EPA was created 50 years ago. And it's cleaner because we've applied technology and ingenuity and regulation to these environmental insults. And so the GDP has grown dramatically and we've reduced pollution at the same time. So this supposed trade-off between economic growth and environmental protection is a myth. It's an unfortunate set of beliefs, but it bears no resemblance to reality. How it became part of our dialogue is something I could talk about for a long time, but not tonight.
Hey, there was a whale in the Hudson River the other day, humpback whale, voting with its fins, saying it's clean here. Naomi Oreskes, the author of this book, Merchants of Doubt, How Scientists Obscured the Truth on Issues from Tobacco Smoke to Climate Change. And last summer, Naomi Oreskes presently also published this book from Why Trust Science, where Naomi Oreskes laid out the case why the scientific enterprise is trustworthy and why the public should trust it. And the arguments she made in this book were tremendously important as we went forward in the biggest scientific crisis, mass crisis, that we've experienced in a century. How did we get to the place that we got to in those two maps that I put up?
Well, of course, this is a very complicated historical story. You know, something as complicated and as vexing as this can't be easily explained in just a few words. But since you posed this question to me ahead of time, I tried really, really hard to do that. So I actually came up with 4 words: economic interest, ideology, pathology. So let me explain what I mean by that. This story begins mostly with economic interest. And by that I mean, and this is what we talked about in our book, Merchants of Doubt, that if we go back to the 1950s, we had a very, very powerful corporation or industry, the tobacco industry, selling a deadly product, a product that was killing millions of Americans every year from lung cancer, heart disease, emphysema, bronchitis, sudden infant death syndrome, you name it, the disease is probably made worse or caused by using tobacco. So what does this industry do? They could try to defend this product, but that's not really credible because the product is deadly. So instead, they wrap up the defense of this product in ideology. And they begin to push the argument that this is really a question of individual freedom and government encroachment, that you don't want the government telling you what to do. And so they try to move the argument away from the scientific facts about the harms of their product into this ideological argument about freedom. And then we see that argument picked up by a lot of different groups. We see it picked up by the right-wing and libertarian think tanks like the American Enterprise Institute, the Cato Institute, the Heritage Foundation, groups like that. We see it picked up and carried very, very strongly by Ronald Reagan, who, when he becomes president, makes the idea of government encroachment a signature sort of rhetorical motif. And we see it picked up then broadly by the Republican Party. So this idea of individual freedom, personal responsibility, and resisting government encroachment, resisting the government telling us what to do, becomes a kind of mainstream platform or plank in the Republican Party platform. And as time has gone on, and it's been used in a wider range of issues, so not just tobacco, but also climate change and acid rain and other environmental issues, it's become more and more pathological, because increasingly as time goes on, the science showing us the harms of these products and activities has become stronger and stronger. So we've reached a point where you really can't deny the science that tells us that the climate is changing because of greenhouse gases. So even though people, of course, have tried to challenge the science, it doesn't really work very well, because increasingly the American people see that the climate is changing. It's become increasingly impossible to argue that that's not the case. So what do you do instead? You argue freedom. You argue that this is government encroachment. And eventually people have, conservatives, Republicans, people on the right wing of the political spectrum, have so deeply embodied this ideology that it's now become a pathology. So now we face COVID-19, where there's no economic interest really in killing 300,000 people, and there's no good economic interest in seeing the economy in shreds. But people have become so committed to this idea of not letting the government tell me what to do, that people are rejecting even the most basic rudimentary public health precautions, like wearing a mask. I did an interview just this morning with two fellows on the radio, a kind of click and clack of politics in Vegas, on this mask question. And there are people who are now saying on the radio that masks don't work. But that's a lie. We know that masks do work. And if you want to pull up that map we have from Kansas, we have very, very clear evidence from lots and lots of areas that maps do work, but yet we have people who are insisting that they don't, because they're so committed to the ideology of individual choice and individual freedom that they can't even accept this basic, rudimentary, and kind of simple solution, inexpensive solution, which is simply to wear a mask. So this was a graph that got published a few weeks ago showing what happened in Kansas, where they had a mask mandate. The governor, actually a Republican governor, proposed a mask mandate, but got a lot of pushback from the Republican-dominated counties and other Republicans in her state. And so they decided they would allow counties to opt in and opt out. And so here you can see what happened when sometime in July, counties were given the option of opting out of the mask mandate. And those counties, the line in blue, are the ones who opted out. You see their COVID rates remain very high, but the ones that opt in and actually adopt masks, the COVID rates plummet. So this is a clear example. I mean, this is a beautiful kind of natural experiment. Same state, more or less the same people, with masks and without masks, and we see clear evidence. And this is a particularly heartbreaking case. I have to say, I have some sympathy for the governor of Kansas, because she said, when explaining this decision, she said, I think we can really trust people to do the right thing. Well, that would be great if it were true, but because this has become so polarized and so ideologically driven, that we're now in a situation we actually can't trust people to do the right thing. And that's really heartbreaking.
So Cornelia Jean was, for many years, the science editor of the New York Times, and I owe her such a debt, because she was the person who hired me after many years of my being a political journalist and gave me a whole new career as a science journalist. And she is the author of multiple books on science communication, including these from Harvard University Press. This is her last book on science communication, Making Sense of Science, Separating Substance from Spin. And Am I making myself clear? I require these books in my courses. She is currently writing a book on, which is kind of a rewrite of her first book on seashores. And she's writing it on coastal land use in the rising sea. Um, Corey, when you were my editor at Science Times, you used to send me to interview Republican members of the House Science Committee. Why did you do that? Um, and what were they like?
At that time, that you're speaking of, if I'm remembering the same time period, the chairman of the House Science Committee, which is probably the most important venue for science conversations in the Congress, was a Republican. His name was Sherwood Boehlert. He was one of the Northeastern liberal Republicans. He was from upstate New York. And I got to know him a little bit, and I got to know the committee's chief of staff fairly well. And they, Boehlert, and the other Republicans on the committee could work across the aisle with the Democrats in the Congress. But at some point, things began to change, and the mood between Republicans and Democrats in the Congress is not just disagreement over policy. People assert that the other side is practically morally degenerate, to completely unacceptable, not someone you could ever do business with. And so that kind of progress has just halted. And the other thing that probably didn't begin at that time, but it has kind of accelerated, I think, is the recognition on the part of scientists, the recognition on the part of politicians that the American public has a great deal of respect for science. So they want to be able to say the science is on my side on any given issue. And they will find ways by cherry picking the data or whatever to allow themselves to make those statements. And so it's not so much that science has been politicized, but that politics has taken on an aura of science. I don't know. It's an unfortunate situation, and there are lots of times when politicians have to make decisions about what kind of legislation they're going to support, and the legislation, sometimes there's no good number, and they want to pass it off to science. They will ask someone, what's the scientific answer to this question? And often the question is not a science question, it's a moral question. For example, I am among the people who would say the question of what should we be doing about climate change is not a question. Science can tell us what's likely to happen if this, that, or the other thing occurs. But the real question of what should our action be on climate change is a moral question. Because I think the question is, what is our obligation to the generations that follow us? And what are we morally obliged to do for them? And what is morally unacceptable for us to do to them? And that's not the kind of question that a lot of politicians want to come to grips with.
Corey, let me ask this. It may be a moral question, but given this polarization, how much did it reflect itself in the lack of public caution when we got to the pandemic?
Well, probably Naomi can talk about this with more intelligence than I can, but obviously, once it became clear that this was a serious situation, even though our president was not embracing that idea, it was clear that doing something to fight it in a big way was going to be extremely economically disruptive. And people didn't want to see that happen for the individual liberty issues, but also the economic cost. And there are also, I think there are real questions about closing the schools, and was that at the end of the day a good a good trade to make or not in terms of the well-being of our children, but we don't know the answer to that. So, but those people suffered as a result of those decisions, and they took it out on their politicians.
What if politicians had said, this is difficult, we have to make sacrifices, this is a national crisis? Would the response have been different?
I don't know if anybody can answer that question, but I personally have maybe it's naive, maybe it's just plain stupid, faith in the people to do the right thing when push comes to shove. But we need to have responsible leadership, and we have not had that. And even among many Democrats, I feel like we have not had that. But that's what is that line from? I don't know if it's from the Talmud or what, where there is no something, the people something. It's just, we're in the dark, and the people who should be leading us are not leading us.
So, Corey, you're someone who believes that the public is not as anti-science as the signs would bring us to believe. Why do you think that?
Primarily, I'm looking at a vast array of data that's been collected over the decades, and the polling and other kinds of data by the National Science Foundation. They put this together every couple of years in a big survey of the state of the research enterprise in the United States. And obviously there are many problems with polling now. It's not as easy to do in an accurate way that it used to be, et cetera, et cetera. But if you want to look at this data, it shows that of all the areas of life in our country, the science and medicine are at the absolute top when it comes to enterprises that people trust. The only one that scores higher is the armed forces of the United States. They score top in trust, but science is right behind, and medicine is right behind that. And journalism, as I might have told you earlier, is way down. And that's not a new phenomenon either, but the quality of the news media that, where people are getting their information from has changed dramatically, and in a bad way, in terms of this kind of situation.
So let me throw something out to the entire floor and jump in, panelists. What can we do, those of us who are science educators, to discourage the politicalization of science, or to make science knowledge more democratic?
Well, one of the things that's happening now, Claudia, is we've now experienced trillions of dollars of economic impact because decision makers, not just in the United States, in China, in Europe, all over the world, did not pay close attention to medical science. So we actually now have one of the best examples of why it's important to pay attention that we've ever had. And I think that this actually creates the possibility of social learning on a large scale. And a lot of it will depend on the leadership of Joe Biden when he becomes president. Because if he can mobilize the country behind the mission of getting everybody vaccinated as fast as possible and getting past this, that will be something that we haven't seen in the United States since, well, you could say the space program. I would say probably back to World War II, when the entire country united behind a single mission. Now, you might say, well, the country is not capable, but we were just as divided in the late 30s and early 40s as we are today, if not worse. The US military in 1939 was still using horse-drawn carriages. So within a half a decade after, by the mid-40s, we were an incredibly powerful military machine. So the question is, can we use this example, because so many people have suffered in such a dramatic way all over the world, and there's really no data that can argue otherwise. Everybody agrees to this. So the question is, can that be transformed into a learning moment for the world? I don't know, but I'd say if we've ever had an opportunity to do it, we're right in the middle of it right now.
I want to start by going back to something that Corey said, which I think is extremely important, which is that certain kinds of questions are not scientific questions. And it is really important for us to acknowledge that. So when it comes to climate change, I completely agree with what Corey just said. I never like it when people talk about what the science tells us we have to do. The science does not tell us what we have to do. The science tells us what the likely consequences of inaction are, but ultimately deciding what to do, how to deal with it, is a question of, it's a moral question, it's an economic question, it's a political question, it's a cultural question. And so I think we need to see social scientists, people of faith, ordinary citizens much more engaged in the conversation about how to solve the problem. And I think natural scientists really need to pass the baton now and let other voices lead on this issue. And I think the scientific community, the natural scientific community, has frankly had a hard time with that. And I think they need to exert a little self-discipline and recognize that there is a way in which they need to pass the baton on this question.
And I have an author for you on this. His
Yeah.
name is Robert Heilbrunner. He wrote something called An Inquiry into the Human Prospect, and it had an afterword called What Has Posterity Ever Done for Me? Which is actually exactly on this question. And he comes to the conclusion that we do care about the next generation. And that he basically took a leap of faith, if you will, that we would pay attention to it. But those were books from the middle of the 20th century that I think have a lot to say about these exact questions. And it's not like, I'm a political scientist, so I'm not a physical or natural scientist. And these are policy issues. You're absolutely right. I think one of the problems here is that the climate scientists in particular were so frustrated by the inability of policymakers to take what they were saying seriously. They started to try to do some of this themselves. And I have to say, having worked at the Earth Institute with some wonderful climate scientists, when they start talking public policy, it's like me talking climate science. You don't want to hear it. Right. Because, I remember having one discussion where a climate scientist said, well, we have to shut down the world economy. And I said, well, if you do that, you'll have mass terrorism. You would have dirty bombs in Times Square, and you'd get nostalgic for sea level rise. Like, what's a little water coming over the side compared to this stuff? So I think it's you're absolutely right. We need these disciplines talking to each other, and the way I always put it is know what you don't know. And there are a lot of things I don't know. And one of the great things about spending time in the Earth Institute was I was always around experts that knew a lot more than I did about the science. And you have to learn how to listen. And it's really important to have these cross-disciplinary dialogues. So I think that's absolutely the case. We can't throw this all on the scientists.
Right, but yeah, so good. So can I just finish the thought though, because I wanted to add one more thing. But that said, there are some questions that are fundamentally scientific questions. And so if we go back to January, when it first became evident that there was this novel virus and that it was spreading and that it was very likely going to spread in the United States and elsewhere, the question about what to do about it in the sense of what is the best way to contain the spread of an infectious agent, that is essentially a scientific public health and medical question. And there we see that the countries that followed the advice of public health experts, particularly with respect to aggressive and organized protocols of testing, contact tracing, and isolation of sick individuals, those countries have done far better, both in terms of saving lives and in protecting their economy. So this speaks to your point, Steve, about the false dichotomy between public health and the environment and the economy, or the environment and the economy. The countries that paid attention to science have done better on both counts, and they have actually saved billions of dollars because it turns out in these cases, the old adage about an ounce of protection, an ounce of prevention being worth a pound of cure is almost always right. So people will say, oh, we can't afford that, it's too expensive. No, actually, it's a lot less expensive. But we didn't listen to science, and a lot of the reason we didn't, I mean, this is obviously a really complicated question, but very early on, the Trump administration made it clear that it would not accept any sort of strong centralized federal response. But all of the countries that did implement large-scale testing and contact tracing programs did it through a coordinated, centralized government response. So we need to re-embrace the notion that there is a place for government in our lives, that government can be efficient, that government can be effective, and it can actually protect us from harm, which is kind of why we have government in the first place. But I think a lot of progressives and Democrats and independents and scientists have been afraid to say that, because the dominant rhetoric of the last 40 years has been a kind of anti-government, limited government rhetoric. And because natural scientists don't actually understand that, the role of that argument, they've not been effective in addressing it.
I think the research community has abdicated, as a group, its responsibilities of citizenship for a long time. They do not take part in these kinds of public conversations. I think, just judging from people I've known, I don't think they necessarily think that ordinary members of the public are people they could actually have a conversation with. I think that that practice has been lethal to us. Even the way the academy is organized, such that if you are an academic scientist, it's ordained by God that if you left the bench for more than a month or two, your career would be derailed forever. So you can't run for Congress, you can't run for the Senate, you can't become the mayor in your town, you can't, do any of this kind of thing. And also, I can say my experience as someone who has been teaching or trying to teach researchers how to talk to members of the lay public, I have seen the amount of conversation that takes place about this in universities, the volume of it rise and rise and rise. The actual useful getting the work done on the ground, I do not see happening. I see lip service given to it. I don't think this is something that the research community has embraced, and I think it's hurting us.
I so agree with what Corey has to say. As somebody who also teaches these courses and rigidly tries to teach people common language, ordinary language, and how to express yourself in the language that most people read and speak, there's such resistance to it. And I see that the attempts by the research community to so-called engage in science communication is very often just another attempt to professionalize the same old thing, and it's not effective in general. What you need to do is speak plain English, tell good stories in the voices that everyday people speak, not in academic language. And there's a great deal of resistance to that, unfortunately.
I'd love to mention something. We spoke about this earlier, Claudia. Yeah. The necessity for decisions in these kinds of situations, the people making the decisions, they should not be limited to some self-selected group of pointy-headed intellectuals who lock themselves in a windowless room somewhere and emerge with what we must do. There needs to be some kind of an effort to broaden the base of the conversation so that there's buy-in ahead of time. And one issue that we see playing out with this now is the allocation of ventilators. Not necessarily because we don't have the machinery, but because we don't have the people who are trained to use the machinery. And that is an issue. I was telling Claudia earlier, I saw a journal article, I wrote about it actually years ago in a very obscure journal that said communities should be having their conversations now with their wide base of people in their community about what are your priorities going to be? Are you going to prioritize children over sick old people? Are you going to treat prisoners with the same status of law-abiding people? How are you going to address all of those when push comes to shove? Because what these researchers were saying was, it is inevitable that we're going to have this kind of a pandemic. Just as the Obama administration in their transition papers to Trump said the biggest threat to our national security confronting us is a global pandemic. But we don't have any of those conversations. And now, apparently, in the Mountain West in particular, people are already, they're calling it crisis care. which means that they're basically parking people until they die because they've decided someone else is going to get the ventilator. And that kind of decision making, another aspect of that, it should not be foisted off on the healthcare workers, because that is what these people who wrote the paper I saw years ago, what they said was having to make those kinds of decisions is corrosive of morale.
Well, to get back to get to what Naomi was saying before, though, the fundamental function of government, the reason we created government was to protect us, whether it was castles that the serfs went into or anything. I mean, that's been the fundamental function of government throughout history. And you have to look at this pandemic as a massive failure of governments all over the globe. Maybe New Zealand's the only one that succeeded.
Iceland too.
And so the question really is, and this is really a significant public policy question, will we learn from this? After 9/11, we spent a lot of money building infrastructure against terrorism. I don't know how, and it's had some success. The question is, are we going to build the infrastructure now against the biological terror of a virus that has had far more massive impact on the world than terrorism has ever had? To some degree, you need science to inform this decision making, but then the decision making isn't made by scientists. In fact, one of the purposes of the programs that I run at Columbia is to equip non-scientists with an understanding so that they can actually interact with scientists. There's such a huge gap. I mean, the place where I saw this at the beginning of my career is at Love Canal. I was in graduate school in Buffalo. What got me interested in toxic waste was going over there and watching the public health people communicate with Lois Gibbs, who was the head of the Homeowners Association, and all of the people in this working class neighborhood, trying to explain to them what was happening to their health. And they did a really bad job of it. In fact, when I went to EPA, and part of my job was to develop a process for interacting with communities at toxic waste site. And we created a position called the Community Relations Coordinator, who was basically a kind of science social worker to explain to people what the technical folks were saying about the cleanup in their place. You needed a translator. There needs to be, in a sense, what you do with your science writing and with teaching our students how to write is the same kind of thing. Some of these things are really complicated and highly technical. They have to be boiled down to something that the average person can understand. And that function is critical for this kind of governance. Even, even highly educated people with lots of background don't necessarily know what epidemiology is. I mean, we've learned more about viruses as a society since last March than we probably did in the previous 20 years. And I think it's a really interesting question. How do we learn as a society to deal with this technical and scientific complexity? We benefit from it, but we really don't know how to deal with the cost side. And that's what we have to learn.
Yes. There's a question. Is there hope about STEM students that they will engage with the public much more than a previous generation? What do you think about that?
So my answer to that is people respond to the incentives that are in front of them. If you are a researcher, your incentives to spend the time and effort it takes to become an effective communicator are virtually non-existent. So I think that's why I keep saying that the enterprise has to change in such a way that people are actually incentivized to do it. Whereas even now, I think people who become good at it are actually stigmatized as being popularizers rather than serious researchers. I don't know if others on the panel will agree with me, but that's
I think that's broadly true, although I guess I'm slightly more optimistic in the sense that I definitely see change. I think that stigmatization was definitely the case, say, when I was in grad school, more years ago than I care to admit. I think there's been a big change, but I'd say the main change that I think I see in the students is that the students really want to do this. Virtually all of the STEM students that I interact with, and of course my sample is probably a bit biased because if they come to a class of mine, it means they have an intrinsic interest in some of the broader questions, but still I interact with quite a lot of students. And I think that STEM students, both on the undergraduate and the graduate level, are actually very, very concerned about these issues. And one big change I've seen in the last 20 years is that it used to be a person went into climate science because they thought that climate science was very interesting, or they had a set of skills that they thought they could apply well in this area of science. Now I see a lot of the graduate students going into climate science because they want to fix the problem, which is a little bit ironic, actually, because I personally think that if they really want to fix the problem, they should become lawyers or policy experts or something else. But that's a slightly different question. But I think that Corey is right about the incentive structure. The students are very, very motivated to communicate better, to address the policy dimensions, to address the public involvement or engagement dimensions. But the incentives, once they go to graduate school, are complete. Or maybe I shouldn't say completely. They used to be 100% against it. Now they're like 95% against it. Now I think you can do a little bit about that, and your advisor will probably say, well, that's okay as long as you don't get distracted. But Corey's absolutely right. There's no substantial, sustained incentive system. There's a kind of sprinkling. There's a little prize here, a little money there. But it's very meager, it's very patchmeal, and it doesn't represent an actual shift in the way the scientific community has thought about the problem.
Well, I disagree with you, if I may, if the moderator may jump in here, because I have graduate students who are also scientists, and I think they want to do good. And I say to them, don't do it for the incentive, do it because it's the morally right thing to do. And there may be no incentives there, but that's not the reason you want to communicate. You're a citizen, and that's why you're doing it.
I do think you have to think about the structure of reward in the scientific community, which what I think Cornelia was talking about. But there is actually another community growing up, and Claudia, we see that in our students. These are students who are in fact cross-disciplinary. What Lee Bollinger and Ken Pruitt at Columbia have started to talk about the fourth purpose of a university, which is actually service to the planet and to the future of humanity, which, research and education and sort of a sense of service to the university has always been part of universities, but this is something new. And I do think you see this strain. Our students that study sustainability and some of the other fields that we're seeing are in it to save the world, literally. And what's interesting is, when I first got involved in the Earth Institute, people like Wally Broker and Mark Kane and others were doing climate modeling. This is around the year 2000, about what was going to happen in 20 years. Well, we're in the 20 years, and actually their models were not just accurate. If anything, they underestimated the impact. So when we started on this, climate was all in the future and it's created everywhere. It's a tough political problem. And now it's here. And these kids, these students, I shouldn't say kids, these students, 2050 is not a theoretical year for them. That's the year that many of them are going to be in their 40s and 50s, younger than I am today. And so to them, this projection of the middle of the 21st century is terrifying and very, very real. And I think that is starting to change things. And then I think this pandemic has shown how important it is for us to build up the capacity to protect ourselves. So whether it's climate change or it's a biological weapon or it's the pandemic that we're now experiencing, we've got to up the game on public health infrastructure. If we don't, every 3 or 4 years, not every 100 years, there'll be some other thing like this going on. And it will pretty much destroy the world economy. So this has become, I think, the top of the list of critical public policy issues. And this year where we're all sitting here, I'm in my dining room, everybody's at home, nobody likes it. And we're not going to forget this soon. So this is one of those, for a political scientist, an event like this is like the World Trade Center, Pearl Harbor, and D-Day all rolled up into one, because it's affecting everybody. And I think we can't underestimate what this is going to do to long-term political and social change, because I think this is one of those pivotal world-class events that I don't know what's going to happen because we've never seen anything like this before.
It's a warning, and how we take it is very, very important. We've got some more questions out there in the Q&A, and I'd like to quickly sort of lightning round get to them if we can. One of our questioners asks, how can we promote communication between scientists and politicians? What do you think?
Who is we in that question, do you think? Or do you want to?
I don't know. The questioner asked, how?
I mean, you know,
let's change it to how can one promote, if I may edit this.
I'm going to say something that is just ridiculously naive, and that is make sure your politicians know, whoever they are, that you're interested in them paying attention to these kinds of things, and that you vote on these. You know, these are the questions that will cause you to vote for somebody or not vote for somebody, and organize your neighbors to feel the same.
Somebody else asked, do you think for-profit corporations have a moral responsibility to reduce their environmental impact? What do you think, Naomi?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that one. So this is a really interesting question because I've been reading Milton Friedman lately as part of my new book project. And I have a group of wonderful colleagues here at Harvard who are beginning, and not just them, there's others too, beginning to really challenge the Milton Friedman, Jack Welch model that the only thing corporations need to do is return value to shareholders, and to argue that there's all kinds of other forms of corporate responsibility. And, you know, that's okay. I certainly think that if they can persuade the private sector to do the right thing in other ways, I'm all for that. But in some ways, I actually find myself a little bit more sympathetic to the Milton Friedman position in the following sense. Not that I think, well, let me explain what I mean by that. Why does the corporation exist? The corporation exists to produce goods and services at a profit and return value, pay the workers and pay the employees and return value to shareholders. I think it's up to the government to actually make sure that that corporation behaves responsibly, however we define what constitutes responsibly. I mean, for me, it's primarily like you don't dump pollution in the atmosphere without paying the true cost or something like that, or you don't treat your workers badly, or you ensure that your workers are paid a living wage, or there's a reasonable ratio between what the executives get and the workers. But I don't think, I mean, I might be wrong and I'd love to be proved wrong, but I think history suggests that in general, we don't get what we want. We don't get fairness and equity by depending upon the goodwill of the private sector. We do it through appropriate and fair statutes and regulation. And that's the role of government. So if some corporations want to do the right thing, I'm all for that. But I think that the idea that we would sit around waiting for it, I think, in my opinion, is a mistake. And I'll just give you one other example. You know, in my early days, I was a geologist. I worked in the private sector. I worked as an exploration geologist for a mining company, not generally thought of as one of the most progressive sectors of the world economy. And I worked for a company that had a very, very good reputation. And what I always say about my company was, we obeyed the law. Right? If the government said we had to do something, we did it because we were a good company. But if they didn't, we didn't. And I think that's pretty typical of most people in the corporate sector. Most people in the corporate sector are not criminals. They don't want to be criminals, and they will obey the law if the law is clear. But if there's no law to require it, then why should they? So that's my view. It might be a little surprising or controversial, but that's how I view it.
I think it would be really interesting to see what would happen if we stopped the long-standing practice in many, many industries, in our country anyway, of privatizing the profits and socializing the cost in the form of pollution, or however you want to call it, environmental degradation, the prevalence of disease, and so on. Some company is making money by causing these conditions to exist and taking no role in remedying them. And if we decided this is no longer acceptable, it would be very interesting to see how would that play out in the real world.
So let me actually say that the answer is both. First of all, you have to have government regulation because you have to have rules. I mean, if you had no traffic lights in Manhattan, you'd have chaos. The idea that you can have an unregulated economy is ridiculous. We've always had a mixed economy. There's always been rules, and there's always been government intervention. I mean, the interstate highway system, ports and terminals, airports, I'm not going to go through that. But here's what's new and I think very interesting. On a more crowded planet, with more observation and with a changing set of values, corporate social responsibility, while I don't count on it, empirically is going to play more and more of a role. Something like 80% of the Fortune 500 are now doing corporate reporting on sustainability. Now, I think there needs to be generally accepted sustainability metrics, just the way we have accounting. And here's the issue for the corporation, why it's not necessarily being good. It's actually self-interest. One is environmental risk. If you don't pay attention to risk, whether it's climate risk or it's financial risk or labor risk, that people won't invest in you. And so that's becoming part of this field that we call sustainability finance. There's risk. The second thing is that it turns out, Walmart and other companies have figured it out, that it's actually cheaper to pay attention to sustainability issues up front. That it turns out that, this actually goes back to Deming, who's a management scholar, who talked about waste is a problem in profitability. So pollution is a form of waste. If I can figure out a way to design into my production process less waste, I'm going to be more competitive. And the third issue is that young people, we're in a brain-based economy, and the smartest people are attracted to the best companies. And guess what they care about? They care about climate and these other kinds of issues. So you can't even attract talent anymore if you don't pay attention to it. So it's absolutely true. We need a structure of environmental law because there's always going to be bad actors and they have to be enforced against. But increasingly, we're seeing more and more companies understanding that, and this is what I say, competent management is sustainability management. If you don't pay attention to these factors, you're just an idiot. And so you're not going to make money and you're not going to attract good people to your business. So the answer to me is both. You have to have an active enforcement and regulatory structure, but you also have to have companies that internalize these values.
We're getting some wonderful and interesting questions, but unfortunately, we're out of time. So maybe we need to schedule another evening for another moment, and maybe an in-person moment when we've all gotten vaccinated. But I really thank our speakers for making the time and wishing everyone a good, healthy 2021. Thank you very much.